Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mark, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. I'm happy to be on. Your show is wonderful. My name's Mark Adamczyk. I'm an attorney in Florida. I've been practicing for a little over 20 years. I'm a real estate attorney by background, and now I specialize in community associations. So I represent communities dealing with their everyday legal issues, and I quite enjoy it. And like most that have been on your show, a lot of great guests you've had on many topics. I have a very strong interest in the Kennedy assassination that started at a fairly young age when Oliver Stone's movie came out. And my parents were from Massachusetts, the Boston area. I was born up there, and we talked about the Kennedys a lot. And then I saw the movie with my father, and I was just blown away about all the different aspects of the case and where it could go. And then so I started reading any books that I could, whether it was pro conspiracy or driven by the Warren Commission report, and just to try to get a balanced view and a knowledge of the case and the different possibilities. And so I went to college in New Orleans for undergrad in the late 90s, and started to get a little bit more knowledge and background on what happened there, the events with Lee Harvey Oswald, and which were, of course, heating up late summer of 1963. And we can talk a little bit about that if you like. I went to the Tulane Library. There I went to school and read all of the original newspaper clippings covering the Garrison investigation, and that was tremendous. Of course, was relevant to the movie that I was so fascinated with, where they covered the Garrison investigation and the activities in New Orleans. So that further piqued my interest. And then for a number of years, I started my practice, started a family, and continued to read and educate myself. And as 2017 rolled around, of course, it was big news that the final release date was coming about under the JFK Records Act, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And I wanted to see what happened. And President Trump was elected. And he seemed like the type of president that was going to take firm action on this. And he said he was going to do it. At the 11th hour, he took a different direction, and we can get into that a little bit. And that really, surprised me, that not only was there not a release at that time, but there was just simply a delay. And an immediate 6-month delay was authorized, and that we can get into what happened after that. So that really got me wondering, what does this statute say? I mean, I had skimmed it before, but then I really started to drill down on it. The JFK Records Collection Act of 1992 was passed unanimously by Congress immediately after the movie JFK that I had mentioned. And why was it passed in such a strong fashion? Well, at the end of the movie, Oliver Stone had a scroll at the end and some, final words for the audience that said the House Select Committee on Assassination Records were sealed away until 2029. And that got people very upset and wondering why. At that point, 91, the movie came out, was almost 30 years after the assassination. And then people are thinking, wait, 2029? Something isn't right there. So a lot of pressure was put on Congress to do something about disclosure and transparency in the case and why the record sealed for so long. And Congress responded, and they passed what it was a groundbreaking statute. And I can talk a little bit about why it is and how it changed the game on declassification of records in this case. So since 2017, I've been studying the JFK Act more and more, really digging into how it's supposed to work and what should have happened in 2017 and before. Really studied on how the review board, the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARB. I know you've had Tom Semelock and Judge Thunheim on your show, and that was wonderful that you could have them as guests because they could give a firsthand account of what they experienced. And so once I started to really understand how the JFK Act was supposed to work, and look back into what happened in 2017 and 2018 and into the Biden administration, really started to develop a focused knowledge on what should have happened by then and what still can be done to address the problems we're still seeing. As you mentioned, I also got involved with other great researchers, writers, and attorneys on a project called the JFK Assassination Chokeholds. That was a book that came out late in 2022 with attorneys Andrew Eiler and Matt Crumpton and researchers Jim DiEugenio and Paul Blow. And that's a book on the assassination itself. It doesn't go into any conspiracy theory or facts, I should say. It just lays out several different chapters. There's 10 of them on different topics of the case, where now that so many more records are out and available, when a researcher or someone who doesn't even know much about the case looks at any of the chapters and topics we discuss in that book, if they go through the record as we know it now, they should come away seeing that there's something wrong with the official record, with the Warren Commission report, and that there's no benign or honest explanation for the parts of the case that we dissected. And we try to keep it all based on the record without any speculation. So my role in that book was largely on the topics we're going to cover today: the JFK records, how that was supposed to work, and what happened in recent years. And I've continued to learn more and more. And most recently, I took the witness statements that were made before Congresswoman Luna's task force that was established earlier this year. Some really good witnesses, some of the best that could possibly be called to talk about the case, all aspects of it. And I really paid attention to that. My friend and co-author Jim DiEugenio was testified on April 1st with Oliver Stone and Jefferson Morley, and some really good stuff got into the record. I mean, this is the first time that Congress has held any kind of hearing on the JFK case since the late 1970s, when the HSCA, the House Select Committee, reinvestigated the case. So to see here in 2025 public hearings on this case again, and having the public, many new folks that didn't pay attention or weren't around in the late 70s, or maybe didn't see Oliver Stone's movie and had read a bunch of books on it yet, they could see really solid witnesses with a lot of important information tell the world what they know. So a great record was created there on April 1st, and then on May 20th of this year, there was a second hearing held by the Luna Task Force. There was Abraham Bolden, Dr. Curtis, who operated on President Kennedy in Dallas in 1963, Dan Hardway, a investigator on the House Select Committee, Mr. Doug Horn, who was a member of the review board, the ARRB's medical staff in the early 90s, who worked with Judge Thunheim, who was the chair of the review board. So, I mean, you couldn't, again, ask for, I mean, you could have so many authors and researchers and experts and witnesses come before the task force, but I thought they did a great job on getting a balanced panel of experts to share their knowledge and experience. And again, continue to create a congressional record here that's expanding in 2025. A really good development was a release of more of the files of George Joannides, CIA officer, and Jefferson Morley was instrumental with that. And the piece of testimony that piqued my interest the most from the May 20th hearing before the Luna Task Force was Judge Thunheim, because that's right in my wheelhouse with the JFK Records Act, and what a better witness than to testify about his experience. And I can share a little bit more about that and today on your show. So after re-listening to Judge Thunheim's testimony a couple of times, I decided to put together a letter to Congresswoman Luna, just sharing my knowledge of the JFK Records Act, how I believe it's supposed to work legally, the statements that we did hear from Judge Thunheim that I found very impactful on May 20th, and then just made my best attempt to lay out a suggested roadmap of what could be done going forward to complete the record. Because, Robbie, really at the end of the day, if you listen to Judge Thunheim's words, the review board did an amazing job. They had a very short amount of time to review millions of pages of records. Their chief function was to consider postponement requests from agencies seeking further delays past 1992 when the JFK Act was created. So when an agency at that point in time turned over their records to the National Archives for mandated review by Judge Thunheim's board, that was done very meticulously by the board. And Judge Thunheim correctly stated on May 20th that the board heard appeals from agencies on postponements on sensitive records, what they believe were sensitive, in over 27,000 cases of postponement. And that's incredible that they could do that. So what the review board did get access to at the National Archives, as required by the statute, they went into each and every record, required the agency to demonstrate a specified reason under the statute for continued postponement. And if there wasn't a strong enough reason for postponement in the 90s, you're still talking 30 years after the JFK assassination. If there wasn't a strong and compelling reason for continued postponement, the review board issued an order providing for release and declassification on a specified date. And there could have been a circumstance, I know Judge Thunheim talked about this on your show very clearly, when there is a circumstance such as a living person no longer being of concern, or a source or method or what have you, that no longer required protection according to the review board's final decision, it was to be released. So that was done in over 27,000 cases. Judge Thunheim made a couple statements that really rung a bell with me. He talked about the delays and resistance they experienced from agencies, chiefly the CIA, some from the FBI. Jim DiEugenio on April 1st talked about how difficult it was, and Judge Thunheim echoed this on May 20th, how difficult it was for the review board to get through a single record on occasions with an agency, taking hours and hours to discuss a single redaction or a page or what have you. And the main theme I think that Judge Thunheim got across was, I think his words were, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that many of the agencies were just waiting out the life of the review board, which is only essentially 3 years. Even though the statute was passed in late 1992, it wasn't until late 94, early 95 that the review board really started work. And they worked meticulously through September of 1998, and they could only review what was provided to them. And that was a main focus of my letter to Congresswoman Luna. It's very clear, based on other things that I've looked at in recent months, that there is much more to the record than what the review board actually saw. The JFK Act couldn't state more clearer that every single assassination record in the possession of a government office or agency as of October 1992 was to be provided to the National Archives within a specified time and reviewed by the board under the standards of the Act. Again, their job was to look at if there was a postponement request from an agency. Millions of pages were declassified without any redactions or withholding. But the records that the agencies turned over to the archives that they wanted postponed, the review board did its job, and they issued orders and final decisions. It even went to President Clinton, and I pointed this out in my letter. It went to President Clinton where there was any appeal or desire of an agency for further postponement. President Clinton didn't overrule a single decision of Judge Thunheim's review board. And I included a reference in my letter to Miss Luna, Congresswoman Luna, of that decision of President Clinton to not interfere or override any decision of the board. He wanted the board to handle it and work it out with the agencies under the process mandated under the Act, and that was it. So, if the point is, and the overall gist of the letter is, if that had been done with every single assassination record that existed at the time that the statute was passed, if that had been done, and unfortunately the board did not have enough time to do it all, but if it had been done, then we would not have the controversy that we still have today surrounding the records. And I pointed out a specific example of what I see as a plan or design by, in this case, the CIA, to create special rules and review protocols for what they considered very sensitive records. And the example that I put in my letter was the House Select Committee, the HSCA sequestered collection. We found Andrew Eiler, my co-author, found a memo authored by the CIA Historical Review staff in 1992, February of 92, 8 months or so before the JFK Act was passed, stating in writing what their plan was for their sequestered collection, how they wanted to maintain existing CIA classification status on that collection. And that memo is astounding. It's linked directly in my letter, and I think it would be great if your listeners could read it and see the clear, what appear to be a clear design to not necessarily go around the review board or directly try to obstruct the JFK Act, but I think that's the effect that it had. And when I listened to Judge Thunheim's testimony again, he said, look, we reviewed what we could. I've seen some of the new releases that authorized by Trump. The review board never saw many of these records. And he also stated that, records that the review board did want to review when it was in office were transferred to the National Archives at a later time. That was the communication that Judge Thunheim gave to the task force, which I think was very powerful and I think warrants investigation, Robbie, because if you have what the review board did, and we can get into that, there's so much more out there. And there's examples we see with the Joannides files. We see with the FBI suddenly finding over 2,000 records and providing them to the archives after Trump's executive order came out earlier this year. And then, of course, the HSCA sequestered collection, we have a memo from the CIA, which predates the statute, saying we think these are so sensitive, this cannot be reviewed by an independent entity. This has to maintain existing CIA classification for review by the archivist with assistance from the agencies, because this stuff is of ultra sensitivity. So you look at what the review board did and you say, well, what did the review board not get? I think it's very simple, and it's a reasonable ask of Congress and oversight committees to bring the archivist in and ask questions on records that were in its possession both before the review board came into office and after it left office in 1998. What records did the review board not get, and where are those? What is the status of those? Who has reviewed them? When should they have been declassified? On what standards? And when will they be declassified? Are they part of the JFK collection of records at the National Archives for researchers to see? Are they redacted? Are they withheld? Those types of questions are still very current. And that's in a nutshell the letter that I wrote. And I hope it gets reviewed and it does some positive towards the final release and certification. You see that the National Archives, the archivist of the United States, under the JFK Act, is required at a certain point in time to make a final certification that everything has been released. It's in Section 12B of the Act. Until the archivist can make a legitimate certification saying that everything that's been provided to the archives since 1992 has been declassified, or here is the existing status, then that final certification cannot be made. And it cannot be made in a bubble or just by saying, yeah, the review board got everything, they did their job, there's nothing else to be done. Well, that we know that's not the case. If you just listen to Judge Thunheim's words on May 20th, records were transferred at a later time. They never saw certain records. When they asked the CIA for certain records, they either got no response or just a delay. So those types of things, I just think need an investigation before the story on the records is complete.
I'm going to try and unpack a lot of that, but really, I wanted to ask you about between September 1998 and October 26, 2017, virtually no mandatory periodic review took place as required by Section 5 and 9 of the JFK Act. Now, earlier in your article that you have on the Kennedys and Kings website, you had mentioned that before the Assassination Records Review Board was established, or was the JFK Act was established, the CIA had with or put away certain records before the creation of the JFK Act. Now, when it comes to the obfuscation and kind of you see the disorganization between the National Archives, the archivists not keeping up with their duty to publicly have these things out by a certain date, also the like CIA and other things withholding records, and also the Secret Service destroying records 2 weeks after Judge Tunheim requested for those, which he has openly admitted to on the show, and I think it's just public record at this point. What do you consider that? A lot of people would start jumping to conclusions of motive. Obviously, there is something going on. I can't tell if it's just government being slow or covering their own ass, which is what Judge Tunheim believes, or they're doing what he stated in his testimony, that they're all trying to kind of eliminate their ties with Oswald when it comes to the agencies, what records they might have on him beforehand. We know about the 201 file that was filed, I think it was Lee Henry Oswald. And then it was, something, and Richard Helms testified to it and said that it could have just been a clerical error, but no one can even explain what a 201 file is, including James Gale, who worked for the FBI for 30 something or 20 something years. So again, there's a lot of weird things where things are not adding up. Now, when it comes to let's start with the first one, the archivist. Should he be culpable of any kind of lack of work or anything that should have been focused on this to have this out to the public? Because for me, as someone looking, into the case now for 3 years and wanting documents that I don't have access to, and now it's all kind of starting to come out, I wish a lot of this stuff should have been trickled out to the people that had researched this for a long time and deserve those. But again, I get what he says about social securities issues, but everyone I've talked to from the ARB says there's not anything that should be withholding these records any longer. It's so many years after the fact. So I want to get your opinion on the archivist, but then also the agencies kind of, submitting things before the JFK Act and also still withholding documentations. Is that a sign of collusion or cover up, which is kind of everywhere in the case, or is it just a sign of bad government?
Well, I can only really look at that's a great question. And, I don't, sitting here, I'm just trying to identify issues that I see that I think require investigation, just answers from the archivists of the United States, both present and past leadership. What I do know is what the JFK Act says, and it mandates certain ministerial duties onto the archivist to collect, organize, publish, digitize, and create a searchable and accountable collection of records, right? The archivist does not have discretionary duties under the JFK Act to make declassification decisions on its own. I'm not saying that that's happened. I just think the questions need to be asked. And so when I, really looked at the middle part of my letter to Congresswoman Lunis, talks about the review board's decisions. We know from research and from Judge Tunheim's testimony that they made decisions on every single postponement request that was before them. And so we know that now the problem with those, and so this is where you get into your question on the archivist's responsibility. I think this is a major problem. So credit to Andrew Eiler for really drilling down, and I've talked extensively with him on this issue and really fully understand it. The review board issued a final decision on each of those postponement requests, right? There should be over 27,000 written decisions of the review board at the National Archives. They're open records, they're assassination records. Those decisions of the review board went on writing into what's called a final determination notification. That was written evidence of the review board's order on the specific record, if postponement was warranted, if it was to be postponed, and until when and for what reason. Okay. If there was a full and accountable record of those decisions, over 27,000 of them, we'd be a lot further along than we are now to understanding the full extent of the records collection. Andrew and two other researchers went to the National Archives in November of 2024 with a specific request for all of the review board's final determination notifications. They were not given any of them on purpose. they got a box that was mislabeled, something like press and public releases, that did contain approximately 450 of the review board's final determinations. Okay. There should have been over 27,000 of them in an organized collection somewhere, and there just wasn't. It was a very specific and focused. All they were asking for was the written record, the files of the review board's most important work, evidence of postponement decisions. The archives couldn't provide it to them. And then a few months later, going into 2025, Andrew sent a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to follow up on his visit to the archives for all the final determination notifications. They responded to him by email this past June saying none of them could be located. None of them. And that's a remarkable response, considering that Andrew and his colleagues that went with him stumbled across 450 of them in a mislabeled box. So that is a good example of what's, I think, an unacceptable job of archiving the review board's most important work that creates the record of decisions made under the JFK Act. So that's one example.
When it came to the silencing of the Assassination Records Review Board, releasing files, they were kind of waiting for the Assassination Records Review Board to run out, much like the HSCA's time kind of ran out. You mentioned a specific period more towards the end where the ARB kind of noticed what it could do. The reason I say that is because I've talked to Tunheim and I've talked to Samaluk, and they didn't know that they could ask the questions that Jeremy Gunn asked when it came to some of the medical interviews and some of the very important stuff. They didn't know that the ARB had that power to do that. That was something that was found out later, and thank God that he did that work, because we have amazing testimony from certain medical or photography people that were there either at the autopsy or at some point that happens to deal with the medical evidence. There is an issue when it came to the whole problem of the Assassination Records Review Board, and I think it's because the agencies never like to share their files when it comes to any of their documentation. This isn't surprising that they were doing all of this, and that, thank God, Andrew found the final determination notices, because I doubt any of the ARB members would have even remembered or bothered to speak up about it. But it's just something like, it's not surprising when I see this happen, and that's why I'm not really shocked, like, if files didn't come out, if that makes sense. I mean, you're analyzing the Assassination Records Review Board, or if you're looking at some of these files and some of the stuff that's been going on that you've explained, are you shocked by any of this, really, after looking at some of the stuff from the Kennedy assassination and then kind of working in this manner and capacity on your own, looking and even getting to maybe speak with Judge Tunheim or look at interviews with him? I mean, they're not shocked at all by it. You're not hearing them scream like this is a complete mistrust of our government. They're kind of like, yeah, I mean, I think they're just like, Tunheim, I think you just covered up about Oswald. He said it so nonchalantly where I was kind of like, is that not? And he's still a lone nutter, but he thinks there's more information, whether they knew him beforehand. But it's not a big thing for him. And I don't think it would be for a lot of the Jeremy Gunn, who hasn't bothered to speak about really a lot of things since, he just vanished off the face of the earth. And I think it's because they looked at the files, they know how this stuff kind of works, and there might not be a giant, blasphemy thing or answer out of it all, but they just don't expect anything out of it, if that makes sense. And I hear that with Blakey when I spoke with him. He didn't think there was conspiracy, but he knows the CIA lied to him. He admitted to that. I think a lot of people that have kind of involved in the government or involved in some of these investigations kind of realize that they're just kind of shouting in an empty well. I don't know if you got that vibe at all, or maybe if you're picking that up at all, but it's kind of where I hate to be fatalistic about it, but I'm happy there's files being released, but again, it's not getting us any closer. We're picking at the same things over and over again, thinking a new document's going to solve it. And honestly, the information's out there already. Like you guys did with your book, you pointed out red flags where any common person who knows nothing about the case would just go, what? Like, what is the clip I have of Horn's testimony? In what world where there's a lone nut shooting the president that the autopsy changed 4 times in 2 weeks? That's all people need, is statements like that. That all they needed at the first JFK hearing is what we should have got, but they brought up Epstein and all these other things that go into things that have nothing to do with the JFK case. That's why I'm kind of curious. Like, I'm a little bit less optimistic about getting a truth out of this. I'm more about now trying just to find what the record is. Like, what is the truth of it all? So I'm curious what your opinion would be.
Yeah. No, I mean, nothing surprised me anymore on just about anything, in particular in this case, because it seems like everywhere we turn, there's questions to be asked. But like you, I don't focus on any particular theory or outcome. I'm purely dedicated to making sure the JFK Act, the Records Act, is fully carried out as written. Because before it came into being, the only standards out there were FOIA and executive orders of the president or other agencies saying national security, we're going to withhold this until we feel like it. So that's why the JFK Act, it's also a blueprint for other investigations. I mean, I know Luna's task force, it wants to get the records out on RFK and MLK and other very suspect cases. And if this blueprint of the JFK Act would be followed, it should work. If the records are provided to an independent agency such as the ARRB to make a decision without influence or unwarranted influence, and they could hear appeals or whatever, and then make a decision and have, like I said, even the JFK Act has an override option for the president and for certain types of records, executive branch records. So the thing about the JFK case, though, and why I'd like to see more time spent on it by the task force, if possible, is it's the only assassination or tragic event that the task force may investigate. It's the only one that has a law behind it for declassification, and that's why it's the starting point in making sure that it's fully carried out, which I think would have a positive impact on the other cases. Back to what does really surprise and shock me as a lawyer is the example I gave on the final determinations, how it's the most important record of the work done by the review board, and it's missing and cannot be located. That is shocking. I think that's complete neglect and or worse. Back to what's sort of driving a lot of this. I did find in talking with Andrew another memo that was drafted on the same day as the memo I mentioned before, February '92. And it's in the Russ Holmes work file, and it comments on the memo that I mentioned, and it essentially says, look, the recommendation here is for the DO, the Directorate of Operations, which at that point in '92 was the CIA branch responsible for clandestine operations, covert actions, intelligence collection, etc. That office should maintain classification over any operational files, regardless of their age. And that is, I think, the attitude that we're still seeing. Like, look, we don't care how old these things are. Those are operational files, and you see that example coming into play with the Joanides files. Jefferson Morley's efforts got more of his personnel file out, but the operational files of Joanides, Bill Harvey, David Atlee Phillips, some of the people that I think really need to be further investigated in the case, those types of files, I think they're going to protect at all costs. And we're seeing written memos from early '92 that the impact of the Stone movie can't be understated. I mean, all of these things were being drafted up right on the heels of that movie and before the Records Act was created later that year. And why? I mean, of course, that movie points the finger directly at the CIA in many ways, and I think they went into full panic mode on their operational files, and they had to quickly organize, see what they had, see what was in their HSCA sequestered collection, because a lot of the sensitive records, they say as much in the memo that I cite in my letter, the sensitive records, operational records, had been collected by Congress in the late '70s in their investigation, and they were, I believe, determined at all costs to keep those either out of the collection entirely at the archives or in a segregated or separate collection where they wouldn't be reviewed by Judge Thunheim's board. And some of them may have been. We just don't know until those final determinations are cataloged to see which records the review board did review entirely and what decisions were made on those. And those that the review board did not see, that's a whole nother investigation. And like you said, Robbie, I think that's an important step to completing the record so that folks can at least see everything that's available. And that's where we're at.
If the National Archives has the power of the ARB or took over the power of the ARB once it disbanded, would creating another independent organization with people like Tunheim, they could be government officials if you want, I would prefer not, but just another organization to be able to review the files the same way that the ARB did and get the rest of those remaining ones that were submitted before the JFK Act, or are those untouchable at this point?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, nothing is untouchable because of the way the statute is drafted. There's no exception for any particular collection. It says every record in the possession of any office or agency, including the records of congressional investigations. And the Act specifically mentions the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, and the HSCA records. All of those were supposed to go to NARA, the National Archives, as of October 26, 1992. For organization, cataloging, and they were to be assigned a RIF number, a record identification form number, for review by the board. That was the process. So we're just seeing strong indications that that was not done before the review board started its serious work before it could start, because it took like almost 2 years to get them fully appointed and funded. President Clinton finally got the board appointed so they could start work.
And even then, they were gathering on people later.
Yeah, exactly. So like between late 1992 and late 94, there was still an opportunity for agencies to get their act together and get everything over to the archives so that they could get RIF numbers. But so I know there's researchers still to this day putting together what happened to records that had a different numbering and cataloging system before the ARB took office, and were those all turned into records in the collection for review by the ARB. I think your suggestion or idea of a new review board is excellent. The archivists, as much as maybe they wanted to be, or the agencies wanted them to be a successor to the review board after 98, does not have that authority in the JFK Act. They don't have discretionary duties. They only, like I said, have ministerial duties as an archivist. So what happened from 98 to 2017, if there was some sort of loose review process to roll down declassification in those 20 years or whatever, there's no evidence that it really happened. And so no, that would, the correct, if you roll back time in 98, because the review board didn't have enough time, as records continue to trickle into NARA after that time, they should have been reviewed by at least congressional oversight committees that could either appoint a new review board or make sure that it was done independently outside of the agencies. And because let's face it, the archivist was easily influenced by the agencies during that time period, because people started shifting their attention to something else. The review board was done. And I think many of us assumed that the work was done by the review board, and there'd be a kind of a roll down from 98 all the way to 2017, leaving President Trump with really nothing to do, maybe issue a final certification on a handful of records. That's what should have happened. And we heard Judge Thunheim say on May 20th to the task force that there really should have only been about 1,500 records, to his knowledge, left for President Trump to even have to deal with in 2017. And why did he say that? Probably because he knew of the 27,000 that they made final decisions on, maybe 1,500 of them were deferred until 2017. I mean, that's a logical reason for that statement. We won't know until we have all 27,000 final determinations, and that's just that batch of records. So it's really, there's a lot of work to be done.
What do you think about the files that are not reviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board that were submitted early, files that still remain out of the ones you're able to get of like the 450 determinations? What the stuff that's left over, what would you consider, if that's even important to the case, if it's still valuable and left? Because if you look at the HSCA, they destroyed a lot of files. I'm blanking on the guy's name right now, but he was in charge, like the Secret Service, that was going through like 5 different filing cabinets and reduced it down to 1. And then you have members of the HSCA that were also destroying files as the investigation was going on. So you kind of wonder what could remain if it wasn't an important document. Everyone wants to see that smoking gun. Do you expect that to be there, or do you think it's just going to be more clarification on certain backgrounds of individuals to help fill in the picture of maybe some covert ops or some other thing that was going on? Because I don't know how much would deal with Oswald, but if you look at like a lot of like the historical stuff or go to the National Archives website, They got Frank Sturgis tapes. They got all these things that they have not released. And that was in the 2025 release. They're audio recordings that are not all available online. I had sent the email at the Nixon Library to the archivist of the Nixon Library. It took 3 months for someone to finally get back to me because if you just type in JFK on the Nixon Library, it'll give you the recordings of anything that mentions JFK. They're labeled weird because Nixon was just a creative guy. They're not labeled anything specific like JFK mentioned. It doesn't say that. It's just KX and then a bunch of numbers, but it mentions JFK somewhere in that recording. You click it, not available online. Please contact National Archivist Administrator. Email this. I waited 3 months. I got 3 tapes. They're 6 hours apiece. I could tell you a lot of it's garbage, but because the recording's kind of crappy. But you do pick up mentions of Warren Commission, Kennedy assassination, James Rowley, these types of things, that names that are important to people who understand the case, where I kind of just wonder, why don't you have this available to the public yet? There's nothing secret about something that was going on during Nixon's administration that was like 50 something, 60 something years ago. It doesn't make sense why they just don't even bother putting that or making it accessible online, which makes me kind of wonder, you can go to better sites that are just researchers, Mary Farrell. That's all researchers doing that and making a good catalog. And yeah, you got to pay a membership fee, but there's a lot of good work and documents that are labeled and classified perfectly, way better than the National Archives is and easier accessible. So I don't see why the archives hasn't even bothered improving or making it up to date. Like the information that is there is just old and it doesn't matter to the general public. Because obviously we can tell through all this that the general public still cares.
Yeah. No, it's that's one of the in one of the recommendations, and there were 5 of them I put in my letter. The last one is demand that the archives comply with the JFK Act and finally create and maintain a comprehensive and searchable catalog and index of all records. I mean, like you said, it's a shame that organizations like Mary Farrell and others try to do it themselves, and they do the best they can, right? Back to your question, and it's in my letter because what I did was I summarized what was in I'm only using the HSCA sequestered collection because it's the subject of that memo that I highlight as a prime example of what appeared to be a plan to have extra sensitive protection on certain records that the CIA was concerned with, right? So in I summarized in the letter what is in those boxes. I mean, it says it right in the memo. And what I think could be of importance today, and again, I try not to comment on what I think is more important to the case than others because I'm focusing mainly on the release of all records. But we did hear Dan Hardway testify in detail recently on May 20th about Mexico City. His job with the HSCA with Ed Lopez was to investigate Oswald in Mexico City, right? And that happened 6 weeks before the assassination. He was allegedly there. And we know, I think many of your listeners know the story about the surveillance tapes, and it turned out that it wasn't Oswald's appearance or voice. I mean, Hoover and his agents quickly figured that out the weekend of the assassination. So there's a whole story there. Dan Hardway talked about his experience with trying to investigate that and the obstruction of the Joanides operation into getting the CIA records. But if there are more records in the sequestered collection that the HSCA maintains on Mexico City, it's referenced right in as to being in the collection. I know Dan Hardway was really only able to conclude in his testimony that the CIA was using Oswald operationally. It was clear to him, and Jeff Morley has said essentially the same thing. And I think the records now support that. So what records are out there that would further show how he was used operationally after Mexico City? Those types of things.
What about the caveats that they use or little escape things to get out of certain releasing of files? For instance, the only example I could think of right now is Manchester tapes. 2075, because of the Kennedy family said so. I'm sorry that doesn't work for me anymore. I know people like to blame the government for withholding of documents, but the Kennedy family is also to blame as well too, whether that's the government forcing them or that's just them on their own accord. Is block researchers, certain individuals from accessing certain materials. I mean, Jack Kennedy's dress is also blocked till 2075, I think. So there's a lot of things that I feel like would be very helpful for people to understand and whether come to their own terms and conclusions in Manchester's tape. A lot of people want to verify if those interviews and what Manchester included in his book was accurate. And the only way we can do that is with the tape recordings that are locked away for another 50 something years. So
Hmm.
that's one thing out of many where they use an excuse. The Kennedy family says so. This is because of
Right.
this and this guy. What do you do to stop all that? Because it seems like they have more power in the terms of when they want to release a file to you, they're going to release the file to you, but they will
Yeah.
not let you have it unless you have really nothing. It's just when they say so.
Right. I mean, there are the only two exceptions in the JFK Act for mandatory disclosure in the National Archives are IRS records and deeds of gift. So I've not, really drilled down on the any claims of the Kennedy family on deeds of gift and whether that falls under an exception to the statute. I think that's a whole nother line of review. I think there's plenty of work to do with the National Archives, which is an agency of the executive branch, and for the archives to be accountable for records collected before the review board, where the final determinations of the review board are, and why have they not been provided to Andrew Eiler or anyone else making a simple FOIA request, and then what happened between 98 and 2017, and what sort of periodic review was done. I mean, how it was supposed to work is when the review board made a final decision when it was in office, saying a record was to be released in 2006, and Andrew and his colleagues found a record associated with one of the determinations they could get, one of the 450. The review board mandated release in 2006, and it wasn't done. So, I mean, why? So is that the archivist said it had a duty, a ministerial duty, to follow the review board's final order for release in '06 that was not overruled by President Clinton, and release it in 2006. So that's just one of maybe thousands of examples that need to be looked at.
What would you consider when it came to the task force ability to be able to actually produce change with what they're doing, besides public kind of elaboration or explaining a little bit more and kind of sparking up the curiosity? What actual access does Luna and her task force have to be able to get some real change going on here? I think a lot of focus is going to be on the MLK stuff, just based on how our society views past, civil rights issues and racial discrimination. There's going to be a large focus on that. I had a couple people actually talking about it today over the Kennedy stuff. But it's the Kennedy, RFK, and JFK. They're RFK a little bit more, maybe gets a little bit more focused, but JFK is one of those long, old kind of conspiracies, or one of the ones that everyone kind of doesn't believe was just a lone nut. But it also is not the main focus when it came to a lot of serious and Epstein stuff and related stuff, which is sad, but it's just a true matter of fact. So I'm wondering what Luna's capabilities and power that she's going to have on her task force compared to all the other stuff that the government's going to be focusing on covering up. I mean, the fact that they haven't released a full list, they're blocking certain tapes, they're doing things already when it comes to more trendier topics, that it's going to be very hard to keep this steam in the public. So it needs to happen soon if it's going to be anything.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually, I'm glad you asked that, because at the end of my letter, I even said straight away, there may be a belief that the task force doesn't have enough time to investigate these types of issues, and I said, well, on the JFK Act record, on the JFK records, anyways, under the Act, it's Section 4E. It says that there's a House and Senate oversight committee that have continuing jurisdiction over the JFK Records collection in perpetuity. Meaning, so what I'm trying to say is, even if the task force has a limited shelf life, which makes sense to start points, areas of investigation, what else? Why else do it? I mean, why only hold a couple of hearings and then move on? I mean, it is awesome that these witnesses have had a chance to put their experience on the record, but why stop there? So these oversight committees that are going to extend beyond, they'll be there forever in Congress to continue. So I think what the task force can do is maybe take some of the points I make in my letter, take some of the concerns that Jeff Morley has and others who have testified before them, and then turn that over in a final executive summary or whatever to these oversight committees for additional review in lines of, and some of it could go to the Department of Justice, but in my area, these oversight committees with jurisdiction under the JFK Act on all the records can continue this work.
I'm going to somehow route this question back to something you mentioned earlier when you were talking in the beginning. But do you believe that this is something that could be so powerful that it could stop a president like Trump in 2017 when he first announced that he was going to release files? Do you think that it could be something so impactful or powerful that it would stop somebody from wanting to release the full, maybe even stuff that would be hidden away from the JFK Act that was submitted beforehand that doesn't fall into the ARP? I only ask that because obviously everyone brings it up whenever a president says no, and it seems like a lot of them just stop releasing files. Now, we did get a good amount from Trump. I figured he's only in office one more time. So he doesn't really have to worry about, them coming after him or making his life hell because he's only got a couple of years on it. But there is that kind of lingering question, which is what if they saw something and then he makes a statement like, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't want to release them either or something like that. Now, I agree with Tunheim. I think it's purely political in that aspect. It has become a political bargaining chip, the JFK records, get to vote for me. I'll release these files. But there is a strong kind of feeling or urgency or lack of urgency in the sense of not these agencies do not want to put their dirty laundry out there to dry. Anything that would happen to relate to any malfunction, like the Secret Service, we know in the assassination was highly culpable of neglect when it came to protection of the president. That's not just with JFK. That extends to LBJ. LBJ's got many phone conversations talking about, I don't like all these Secret Service around me. They're lined up like 110 soldiers. One of them's about to fall over and a gun go off and accidentally get me shot. It's something like that where you kind of notice and you have a different perspective after hearing that about these agencies that you were kind of brainwashed to believe were these like studs, if that makes any sense. So I know an agency would definitely want to cover up that embarrassment, such as like with the HSCA, the CIA person that broke into their safe and went through autopsy photographs without wearing gloves, went through a diary and left it on a windowsill. It was part of MH Child, which was that babysitting operation program that the CIA had conducted. And Blakey had to deal with this and did an off-the-books meeting, and nothing was ever discussed about it again. So obviously there's a big amount of power behind these agencies in wanting to protect themselves and their credibility, not only in the eyes of the American people, but the eyes of nations, other nations around the world that could be viewing them. So I'm curious, do you think an agency could be that powerful to block something or scare the president so much or make his life hell to the point he couldn't release something?
Well,
big question.
That's a great question. We know that they've fallen into line, and Trump has taken a much stronger stance on it recently, and it gets back to when he issues an executive order saying release all the files. Is it all the files? And that's kind of my point in this letter. And I've raised reasons why I have a strong reason to believe that it's not all the files, because it starts with seeing, what is at the archives and what protections are given to certain records and what has not been turned over to now what's not been turned over to the archives. You're relying on the very agencies that want secrecy to voluntarily turn them over. Fortunately, there's so many great researchers and authors out there who have identified specific things that they know to exist that are certainly not findable in the archives collection on online or whatever. So getting this case, the things that I do know, and which has come out in these recent hearings, and I think raises some questions, is if it was as simple as agency neglect. If the CIA had been monitoring and knew all about Oswald up until Mexico City, up until Dallas, and then he just went along and killed the president with no really explanation, no help from anybody, why doesn't the CIA just say that and prove that with a document or something and say, what, we were negligent, and he was off the security index at the last minute. We didn't think he was a threat, and he just did this. We're embarrassed. We're sorry. It won't happen again. They won't even say that, and we know that there's records showing operational involvement with Oswald with no explanation of that either, other than they're out there. So when they're talking about what is still in the records, I don't know. I just want to see a complete collection, but there's still protecting something. And I think Dan Hardway said as much on May 20th, because he could only talk about his experience in trying to investigate Mexico City and how it became extremely hard and almost impossible when George Joanides came into the picture. But he concluded his testimony by saying they're protecting something, and that's why we were stonewalled. So how that gets the president to act or don't act, I don't know enough about that. But it's fascinating for sure.
Now, is this your first kind of, I guess, view of the kind of agencies and the neglect and kind of the dysfunctioning side of it? I would say, like the lies, or are you kind of well versed in like some background history of like, let's say, the '60s, '70s, some stuff that was going on back then that was not necessarily up to par with what we would consider normal history standards. Operation like MK Ultra, the stuff that goes on, those backgrounds. Mockingbird, for instance, I think it was just Tulsi Gabbard recently said that it was still going on, and I was like, I could have showed you that shit. They have fucking on LBJ's tapes. He's talking about get Henry Luce to tell this damn article of the Washington Star that they can't report on something like this, or that they're lying, or they're all covering the whole LBJ tapes is evidence of Operation Mockingbird and talking with people that own different magazines and corporations. So that wasn't new for me, but again, a lot of people didn't even know what Operation Mockingbird was, and then they go back and see it ends after 3 months in the year '63. So it's like, what is going on? If it's still continuing, they're saying it's still going on. Is there more that was going on? I was curious if you had any knowledge of some background historical operations like COINTELPRO, the invasion of the FBI into radical groups. Largely evidence supports that they were just invading the Black Panther Party, but like telling Martin Luther King to go kill himself and writing a fake suicide letter the FBI did that's in the church committee hearings, and then creating a heart attack gun. You know, that came into the JFK case knowing that already. So I was very, very quick to be like, oh, the government would totally do something like that. And I think you need that because a lot of people, they read some documents and they're like, this must be fake. Like when the Operation Northwood stuff was trending again, like I think a year and a half ago, everyone was calling it a fake document and this isn't real and all. And it's like, it was a plan, but nobody signed it and went through with it. It just lets you know that the government puts their heads together and the CIA, FBI can be the most creative of the bunch and just start tossing out things that sound like it's like I don't know, like some type of weird acid trip dream. They're just exploding seashell. That'll work on Castro. You're like, right. Yeah.
Well, the last one you mentioned is probably the one I'm most familiar with. That the Northwoods documents was a discovery of the review board, and it keeping this JFK centric, I guess. You have. Jeff Morley's done great work on the Amspell operation that had direct involvement in contact with Oswald in New Orleans. I've studied that extensively as well because of my time in New Orleans, and that brought Oswald very publicly out as a alleged or supposed Castro supporter. Right, that operation was successful if that was the goal of it. And it certainly seemed to be the case because the very afternoon of the assassination, within hours of Dealey Plaza, the same network that had the direct involvement with Oswald in New Orleans, the Amspell CIA group, the DRE, anti-Castro Cubans, that group was responsible for the worldwide release of Oswald's background and his activities in New Orleans on TV and on the radio. I mean, it's incredible to see it happen that quickly. And then you also, if you mentioned Northwoods, while it may not have been officially carried out by the Joint Chiefs or whatever, what happened in Dallas was the blueprint. It was a catastrophic event on U.S. soil to be blamed immediately at Castro and Cuba, and that's exactly what happened in Dallas. So again, there's probably not records that say, yeah, that's going to be the plan for Dallas, and here's how we're going to use Oswald. But again, if more of the dots are connected from the operation in Mexico City for the following 6 weeks up to Dallas, if there's more records that shed light on that time period or not, maybe there are not any. But until the records collection is complete, we're just using our best educated guess.
kind of at a wrapping point here. I hate to ask you this question. It's not who did it. It's specifically the question of when it comes to Mexico City. Do you believe it was a double, or do you believe it was someone using Oswald's name? Because obviously that is one of the most not controversial, but it is one of those cloudy areas in the case. It seems like people have opinions on either side.
Well, it is a big deal because not only with the timing before the assassination. I mean, if you read the Lopez report, which was co-authored by Dan Hardway and Ed Lopez, they weren't even certain that Oswald was there, and if he was there at the same time as an imposter, there was certainly someone using his image and likeness at the embassies because no one can buy the story that if he was at the embassy over five, I think up to 10 times at each agency total. I'm sorry, embassy. And they had this state of the art, best in the world. I forget the name of the camera system, but it was the pulse cameras. And it should have got an image of Oswald, and it obviously what they produced wasn't him. Same with the audio recordings. I mean, Hardway and Lopez issued letters of indictment for David Atlee Phillips and Ann Goodpasture, his assistant, after they investigated Mexico City because the outright lies about Oswald. And so, I mean, that's all record, and I do think that Mexico City, if to me, because of the proximity of the case, because of an operation using Oswald or an imposter, his image and likeness and his background, and because of the immediate release after Dallas of the Kostikov meeting, that comes back to Angleton's group. So, there's definitely a serious point of investigation there. How do you do it now? It's just the records, because witnesses, other than Dan Hardway, who did his best to testify a few months ago on his investigation as into Mexico City and the obstruction he faced from the Joanides operation. I don't know how you investigate fully Mexico City until all the records are out, and that's we're trying to put the pressure on Congress to make that happen.
I don't want to kind of play clips here, but I do have a couple on Mexico City, specifically just pointing for anyone that wants to go to the channel and look at it. There's Marina Oswald's testimony to the HSCA. There is a clip I can play where she just randomly remembered the Mexico City trip, and they were asking, like, why did you suddenly remember it? And it kind of explains a little bit of external pressure from the FBI, which again, there's a testimony with Marina where they were asking her to explain what the FBI's treatment was because she said it was the worst. And she just explained that they were not very nice to her and they were very forceful. And then there's a phone call with Thomas Kelly, the Secret Service agent that was in charge of going down and investigating this whole thing. He's actually seen in multiple photographs of when Oswald was being arrested. He's in the way back. You can see that on my channel as well, too. He's wearing like black rim glasses. He didn't have an order of what to do to go down there, but he was also told by J. Edgar Hoover that like accepting Marina Oswald in her hysterics right now is the best possible time to get a confession out of her. And you can use that as well too. So I have all this stuff listed. I can put it in the comments below, so I won't, waste your time with playing clips here. But there's a lot of things like the Richard Sprague talking about the photos of Oswald in Mexico City, how the photos don't match the person. Hoover saying he's down there and we got him here, but it's not conflating with this time. And, there's a bunch of other things that are going on that just seem like there's a giant misunderstanding of the whole Mexico City situation. And sadly, we're just looking at a record because it wasn't investigated properly. Which is hopefully we can get some answers, whether it's based in documents. Maybe, a lot of people are pointing at the Russia files of things. But again, that's another caveat to not releasing files. We'll release files when Russia releases their files. Well, Russia's not releasing their files until you guys do it. Well, I guess we're going to be sitting here for 60-something years until someone annies up. So there's a lot of more things and problems I see. And hopefully towards the end of this, we can possibly get the task force to at least establish something or somebody to pass something. I don't care if it's a small act or something on the terms of making all JFK related files, JFK related information, documents, films, photos, audio, sounds, not in the collections and privacy established to the person that it was gifted to, or if anything could possibly happen where the sixth floor museum doesn't claim the rights to the Zapruder film. Which is insane because that is historic and it's public. It should be public. All these phone calls are in the public domain. But again, they're not all online. There's certain ones that are taken off, whether it's the LBJ library hiding a certain conversation between Jackie Kennedy where it might sound more than normal. But again, this is stuff that's the public information. It's history. It should be involved and it should be easily accessible, not just something where you have to take a 6 hour bus ride to get to an archive station and go through files and boxes that aren't even there. So I don't know. I'd like to be hopeful in that aspect if we can get that out of anything. You don't need to tell me who did it. I'll keep digging until I find something. But I appreciate your time, Mark, talking about all this stuff too, and explaining kind of the work that you've done and your information when it came to dealing with the Assassination Records Review Board and some of the stuff dealing with Luna's task force. I'm hoping for the task force at this point. I listened to her on Joe Rogan for like 3 hours, and she kind of restored a little bit of confidence, I guess, when it came to her knowledge on the case. It definitely seems like she caught up pretty quickly on some certain aspects. I know she's working with Morley. I think she admitted to that, but I appreciate the work that you guys do and also the Chokeholds book, because like I said, you guys going through that and just kind of pointing out the red flags is honestly what we really need at this point. No, just deep explanations of here's the background history that happened in 50 that led to the 60s. And I'm like, okay, well, I get 2 chapters in and I'm like, all right, let me turn it over. This is a lot easier. You just point out this doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. So Mark, please, if you can, give everybody a minute here to hear your links, where your social media profiles are, anything that you want people to go follow you, check out, and I'll make sure I link it in the description below as well too.
Yeah, thanks. The easiest way to see information and updates from our group of authors and attorneys is on our at JFK Chokeholds X account. Andrew and myself, or anything we come across or think that's of interest to not only get in front of the task force in that way and to others is that's the best way. And like I said, the book Chokeholds talks in the last chapter about a lot of the things we've covered today, but there's so much more we've learned since then. So having a chance to talk to you about it and getting it on our Chokeholds X account is the best way for folks to see what we're learning and continue to learn and talk about.
I'm very grateful for you joining me on this episode of Out of the Blank, and also grateful for Andrew's time as well too, explaining some of this stuff. I know the legal stuff kind of goes over my head a little bit. But I don't know. That means if I did something wrong, I don't have to say, I could be, I didn't know. But I'll make sure I link all your links in the description. Thank you again. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank, and stay tuned for our next episode.